name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Christ is risen. This morning is St. Thomas Sunday. You know, the Sunday of the year that typically has the highest attendance is Palm Sunday. The Sunday of the year that typically has the lowest attendance is St. Thomas Sunday. It is a little bit funny, isn't it? Our lives are a little bit of a liturgy in themselves. They show us the meaning of things. St. Thomas Sunday, I actually have wondered, there may be people in the world who have never heard a St. Thomas Sunday homily, because they just don't show up that day. But I actually understand it. In fact, my family and I, we went camping from Bright Wednesday until just yesterday. We came back yesterday. I figure I'm the priest. That's the reason why I'm here, If I was someone else, maybe perhaps I'd find myself still snoozing out in the woods, I don't know. But the gospel reading for St. Thomas Sunday, there's so many good things in it. The Synaxarion reading reminds us that St. Thomas's encounter with Jesus is one of those gospel readings that remind us that Christ's resurrection, that we ought not forget that the Christian gospel proclaims that Christ's resurrection is one of his body, that it was not spiritual alone, but was of his body. But there are some other things that are worth mentioning about the reading. Today I want to speak to you a little bit about doubt. After all, we do call Thomas Doubting Thomas, don't we? And if you listen to the hymns of the church this morning, you'll see that doubt is in fact one of the themes brought up in the hymns, both in Vespers and in Orthros. Doubt, at least for me, friends, when I went to college, I went to a Christian university, by the way. When I went to this university, doubt, for me, seemed to be a little bit glorified, in fact. And the reason is, I think, because doubt has a sense of sincerity. When one doubts, it's very often the case that we perceive it to be genuine, an expression not of desire, but of some kind of necessity. As if, we are all just free thinkers, freely frolicking through the fields of reason and ideas, and every now and then we encounter one that just really gets us, and we can't overcome it. And thus doubt enters into our minds. But the scriptures don't speak very highly of doubt, in fact. Think of it. Of course, there's Thomas. He doubts, and Christ's words to him are, "Blessed are those who believe yet didn't see." He elevates those outside of his circumstance. Think of St. James when he writes about doubt. This is actually one of my favorite passages. St. James in his epistle says, "The one who doubts is like a wave thrown here and there by the winds of the sea." Doubt isn't glorified in the scriptures. And I think it is because doubt isn't actually objective and free. It isn't a necessity that we encounter because of our honest and genuine and sincere intellects. Doubt is much more like a passion, friends. Consider the other passions. For instance, though you can't choose to be hungry, hunger can set itself upon you, and you know how you might go about becoming hungry. Similarly, though you couldn't choose to sleep, you know how you might go about becoming tired. All of the passions can be riled, and they are riled by our dispositions, our behaviors, our habits. Belief is much more like a passion, Doubt is much more like a passion than it is like a mathematician who's objectively discerning an unerring formula. Belief is even less like a mathematician that is discerning an unerring formula. Belief, which is the opposite of doubt, is much more like a relationship, a movement of the heart. In modernity, we very often think of doubt as the opposite of certainty, but this isn't the case. Doubt is the opposite of belief, friends. And belief is like a relationship. If one wishes to sustain a relationship, friends, then there are certain things that one must do. For instance, your marriages. Not everyone's married, but I might as well speak to it. If one wishes to sustain one's marriage, one needs to develop a couple habits. For one, a marriage, much like belief, requires a kind of commitment. If one wishes to sustain their marriage, then this commitment must be coupled with certain habits of fidelity. If one wishes, friends, listen please, if one wishes to sustain one's relationship, one must be faithful. This, I hope, is the most obvious thing in the entire world, but perhaps it's not. The same is true of faith, dear friends. If one wishes to sustain their faith, they must be faithful. They must embrace habits of fidelity and put off habits of infidelity. For instance, if someone is struggling, perhaps, in their marriage, and they're facing different kinds of temptations, I'll tell you from experience, there are always some signs that accompany these struggles. One is the presence of supportive friends. That is, friends that support your struggle. Friends that lend a soft ear to your complaints. Friends that you gently whisper to all of the failings of your spouse. Indeed, the quiet whispering of the failures of our spouses is a habit of infidelity that accompanies and precedes the destruction of a marriage. Those slight and silent whispers, these are like prayers, friends. But they're like prayers to the demons. And the demons, you can be sure, hear your prayers, and they'll answer them. Habits of infidelity, they always lead us to infidelity. Habits of unbelief, they lead us to disbelief. If one wishes to sustain a relationship, one must put off the habits of infidelity, and one must embrace the habits of fidelity. When it comes to faith, perhaps it seems odd that the church continues to encourage us to do these most basic things. For instance, to go to church, to have a simple habit of prayer, to love one another, to submit themselves in humility to the teachings of the church, right? If one puts off all of the habits of fidelity, it doesn't take a wise and deep thinker, someone with foresight beyond imagination, to predict that right after such a thing, doubt comes. Disbelief. Not only are habits of infidelity, not only do habits of infidelity accompany infidelity or precede it, Forgive me, I've lost my place here already. That's okay. I've already said enough about that anyway. It's enough to reiterate. Habits of infidelity, friends, they precede infidelity. In the same way, if we wish to sustain our belief, habits of faithfulness have to precede our faith. They have to go along with it. In my experience as a priest, and well before that, in fact, you as lay people, you will all know if you've been Orthodox for more than 15 seconds, that what happens is when one becomes Orthodox, somewhere within the first 3 years, maybe right around 3 years, there's something like a lulling to sleep, a walking away, or at least a temptation to. It comes very regularly. Have you seen it, friends? Happens very regularly. And you have to wonder why. Was it that we were not catechumens quite long enough? Is a year not enough? Is it that we didn't really encounter the Orthodox faith or Christ before we became Orthodox? You think that's what it was? Do you think we were unaware of the imperfections of our Orthodox brothers and sisters before we became Orthodox? Were we so fragile as to be scandalized by imperfections of all Orthodox Christians? Is it because we just didn't know they were there before we entered the church? Are these things really things that could cause doubt? I don't think so. I think that within a few years, we're tempted to put off our habits of fidelity. In the beginning of our marriage, in the beginning of our relationship with Christ, we are encouraged. We are so encouraged that the habits of faithfulness feel bright and new. We perceive Christ coming into our hearts in prayer. We perceive miracles, I tell you. There's no one who perceives miracles more than the newly illumined. But, a few years in, what is it? What is it, friends? A few years into marriage, what is it? Has the person changed? Did you learn something new about them? No. This isn't it, friends. Just as prayer, fasting, and almsgiving are disciplines that lead our spirits closer to Christ, there are anti-disciplines. They're the opposites. That if we participate in them, friends, then we can be sure that our hearts will be led to disbelief. The saints, as we see their lives, the saints very often find themselves in the worst circumstances. The very worst. Can you imagine worse? I can't. The worst imagined circumstances have been experienced by saints. In imitation of Christ's cross, saints have been slain in every imaginable way, have been led, captive into the worst kinds of life, have been frozen, have been imprisoned, have experienced the worst kinds of pain. If it were naturally the case that such experiences would lead a rational mind to ask questions like, does God hate me? Then you can be sure that the saints would have done it over and over again. But the saints, dear friends, they have established in their hearts such habits of fidelity that they have shown such responses to be completely unnatural. That our response to God in every circumstance, the saints have shown us that those are choices. And that it is our choices, our habits of fidelity, that lead us either into deeper relationship with God or grant us shaky ground on which we can stand for a little while, grasping onto our friends, hopefully being able to persevere. or perhaps even fall. St. Thomas is shown to be a saint because in the end he chose Christ. You know this isn't always the case. Do you remember when the rich man died along with Lazarus and he goes to Hades? He looks up and sees Abraham and Lazarus standing in Hades across that great chasm. And the rich man begs them. He begs them to send somebody to tell his brothers. Because perhaps they didn't know. But Abraham tells him, they have Moses and the prophets. They wouldn't believe even if a man were raised from the dead. This is what Abraham says. The teaching of the scriptures is very clear, friends. Our doubts, our disbelief is a condition of our hearts, much like a passion. Something that we can ward off through habits of fidelity. I think this is a simple enough message. I perhaps have repeated it enough times for it to come through. But if you struggle with doubt, friends, as everyone does, I tell people every now and then, every Wednesday and Friday, I wake up agnostic. I'm just kidding, okay? It's a joke. It's a joke. Wednesday and Friday, it's an Orthodox Christian joke, okay? But if you struggle with doubt, and many people do, that is the passion of disbelief, a movement of your heart towards disbelief apart from Christ. And I just encourage you to pick up habits of fidelity. Lastly, and I know my homily is very long, friends, do you remember when the Pharisees accused Jesus? Because Jesus, he eats with tax collectors and sinners. I think perhaps in modernity we can't actually even imagine what the real scandal there is. Can you? What's the problem? We, I suppose, are so used to the scriptures, so used to Christian teaching that we can't even figure out what the problem was. Why would they object to him eating with tax collectors and sinners? I'll tell you why, okay? So that you can appreciate Jesus' teaching more and more, okay? Because if you merely eat with tax collectors and sinners, you're a fool. And it's very likely you are one or will become one yourself. There's danger, friends. This is why the Pharisees knew it. Did you know it? There's danger in submitting your heart and your life to those who are far from Christ. Did you not know? And here's the key, and this is why Jesus shows himself to be wise. Jesus, though he ate with tax collectors and sinners, never began to change his preaching, not once. In fact, when Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, he persisted. He said these words. Listen, friends, he says, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." The one who merely eats with tax collectors and sinners, they will face the temptation of doubt, the passion of doubt. Because upon coming to love sinners, one faces the temptation of asserting that they are no longer sinners. It's a temptation of love. So, embrace habits of fidelity, friends. Act as if doubt is a passion, and war against it like your other passions. In the name of the